Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Fantastic Four. The Fantastic Four movie, in theory, has a lot going for it. It's not a paint-by-numbers superhero origin story. It's trying to do at least something different, and it has a lot of ideas about how to do that. But unfortunately, it seems to have a lot of ideas, but none of them exactly connect to make a real Fantastic Four movie. Some of them are good ideas for the Fantastic Four, some of them are not. Some are just ideas that probably seem like they would work and it didn't turn out, or it's just an execution problem. But it's really a movie that's ambitious in what it's trying to do. It's ambitious in trying to actually make a live-action movie of the Fantastic Four, a comic that many have felt is almost impossible to make into a movie, and it kind of continues that tradition, and certainly it's better than those other movies, but it's not the Fantastic Four movie that we've all been waiting for and that we've all wanted for so long. Reed Richards, as a kid, is trying to make a transporter to transport matter from one location to another, or even a person, and so he starts in 2007 in Oyster Bay, Brooklyn, in his parents' garage, and him and his friend Ben Grimm make this transporter and actually do transport a toy car to where no one knows, but they get some sand back, so they imagine they transported it somewhere, and then it becomes kind of Reed's lifelong obsession to make a transporter, which he knows he can. But then at a science fair where him and Ben Grimm are doing the same exact experiment, even better this time, and it actually works, transports like a styrofoam airplane and brings it back, and Franklin Storm, who's working on a similar idea in the Baxter building, goes to the high school science fair with his daughter Sue Storm to recruit Reed to work on this trans-dimensional transporter, and he also recruits Victor Von Doom as they work on this experiment to hopefully go into another dimension. And then they successfully get an ape to go there and come back, and then eventually find out that NASA is going to step in and take all their tech and eventually have someone else go through rather than them. And then after a night of drinking decide they should go through, so Victor Von Doom, Reed Richards, and Johnny Storm decide to go through and somehow bring in Ben Grimm, who's kind of been missing from a lot of the movie once Reed goes to the Baxter building. And they go to this other dimension but see this weird energy stuff that touches all of them, and then when they come back, even though Victor Von Doom is left in that dimension, they come back with strange powers, and Sue Storm, who is there to kind of bring them back, gets hit with the material as well. And so then they are freakishly transformed with powers and have to learn how to use these powers, and are being controlled by the government and used as pawns, and eventually be able to go back in the dimension and figure out how to hopefully reverse these powers, and hopefully maybe even find out what happened in that extra dimension. The problem with making a superhero film, and especially a superhero origin film, is you're not just telling the story of the plot or the story itself, you're also trying to get these people into these superheroes. It's not just really about the story of the film, it's also about introducing those characters and having you fall in love with those characters. If you look at the first Iron Man, it does that. You look at a lot of the Marvel films, it's just as much about the plot as it is at connecting with these characters. And the Fantastic Four movie isn't really as interested in that, and that really hurts the film. In certain parts it cares more about character development, but overall it's more about the story of the Fantastic Four, not really about the Fantastic Four. We're supposed to fall in love with them. We're supposed to really like these characters. We're supposed to want to see them in a sequel film. I like a lot of the darkness to it. I like the hard sci-fi elements and how it really bases these relationships that's supposed to keep us going, but it doesn't really develop very well, so they're kind of meaningless. It kind of tries to be a different superhero movie, but ends up kind of being a mess of a lot of ideas we've seen before, but at least in an interesting way. You kind of have to give it some credit. You can kind of tell it was studio mangled, whether it really was or not, or Josh Trank saying that to kind of just save his ass on a very messy movie. There's no real highlight scenes where you really fall in love with Michael B. Jordan as the Human Torch, or you really fall in love with The Thing, or Sue Storm, or Reed Richards. Probably the most out of anyone in this film. It's really a Reed Richards movie, but I don't think Miles Teller gets to be his usual charismatic self in this film. He's more of this kind of nerdy, shy guy, which he plays off rather well, but it's not really the charismatic Miles Teller that we all kind of love from Whiplash. Flash and things like that. You definitely wouldn't get from this film that the Thing was like a really cool character to kids in the 70s. Like, kids would have t-shirts that say it's clobberin' time, and you would get no indication of that like at all from this movie. Instead, the Thing feels like your depressed uncle who has kind of a drinking problem, who sits in the corner during Thanksgiving. Now, of course, he was created by a guy who was probably your drunk uncle who sits alone and depressed in a corner during Thanksgiving. And it goes more into like kind of the depressed Jack Kirby side of Fantastic Four. That's definitely part of Fantastic Four and what made the comic so great. And this isn't actually adapted purely on the Jack Kirby Stan Lee stuff. It's more based on the Ultimate Fantastic Four stuff. However, the thing that made Fantastic Four cool and what made Fantastic Four such a name is that not only could it have those really dark elements and they would all fight and not really like each other, it was still a fun book and it was still a fun story. And as fantastical and weird and depressing as it could get, it would still have some fun to it. It would still have some adventure. And Fantastic Four, this version, doesn't really get into that at all. And it kind of goes way too gritty. It's kind of like those kind of superhero movies where they're almost embarrassed to be a superhero movie while still being a superhero movie, since it's a Fantastic Four movie where they wear very, very dark blue and the Thing's not wearing pants and they're super edgy. It reminds me of the first couple X-Men movies, but it has even less joy or any interest in trying to be the comic book. It's really trying to do this original thing, but it doesn't seem to really know how to get that entirely to work. When you get to a character like Doctor Doom, who they kind of just waste on being the villain in this film, I really don't like in the movies where Doom goes on the adventure with them and gets powers at the same time as the Fantastic Four. I feel like the first movie probably should have had a throwaway character. They could fight a big monster like on the cover of the very first Fantastic Four issue, or the Mole Man. Doctor Doom feels like somebody who should really get his own movie, like kind of like the Joker in The Dark Knight. Like, they left Joker for the second film because he's very important, because people care about him, because he's really like somebody who deserves a lot more attention. And they kind of just waste Doctor Doom in this movie. I wish they'd gotten to do more with Doctor Doom, but they really just kind of waste him as kind of just the expected villain. And even the third act just feels like, oh, we're a superhero movie, so we have to have this cool like third act showdown. And it almost feels like tonally a different film. It feels like suddenly it became this colorful superhero movie. The Thing looks more colorful. It feels like it's more interested in being like a regular kind of Avengers Marvel superhero movie than it was in the previous parts. It felt like odd, like when the whole scene ended towards the end of the film, which isn't really giving away much, I guess. I kind of looked around in my seat like, wait, are we gonna go back to that other movie? Like, what just happened? I liked the movie that was going on when there was more into the science stuff and the dimensional travel, and it felt like something that was really into the wonder of science fiction and less interested in the characters. It's just more interested in the story of this wonder and the kind of fantastical elements to it. And it kind of reminded me of like dorky sci-fi movies that are way more interested in its dorky sci-fi-ness than really going into these characters, because it just failed at really doing that. It was tonally kind of all over the place, because certain sections they want things to connect and they don't. I don't know what the exact deal was with this movie and what exactly happened with it, but the film itself just feels messy. It doesn't feel like certain things connect. It doesn't feel like certain characters play as well as it should. It does feel like a very dorky science fiction film, and that's elements to it I really love, and I think that's when Fantastic Four really comes alive. But it just doesn't give you enough action and fun that I can't imagine a mainstream audience would really like it. They have cool things like the Thing works for the army for a little bit, but they just show you footage that someone's watching on a TV screen while they talk about it. They could have had a really awesome montage or just a cool thing they could have cut to in the trailers or something like that. Kind of don't understand why they didn't do that. Felt like there's a lot of times they could have had more fun than they really did, but they don't really get into it. And when they finally do, it doesn't really go on that long, and it feels like the studio kind of made them put it in to do the typical thing that a superhero movie should do. I think it does have some cool Cronenberg-y elements to it, and it has some different, darker science fiction elements to it, but combining a different genre with a superhero movie is something Marvel Studios, not 20th Century Fox, does very well. And if they had learned how to do that, to combine that with a superhero movie, like look at Winter Soldier. Winter Soldier can be dark, it can be funny, it can be a superhero movie, and it all works. But Fantastic Four is kind of like someone trying to do that ambition, trying to combine all these different styles and kind of completely failing and making a real mess of a Fantastic Four film. It's at least an ambitious failure of the recent superhero genre, where they're trying to do all these things that sounds cool, it sounds like something that could work, but just completely fails and makes a messy, intriguing, ambitious movie. And Fantastic Four shouldn't be a messy, ambitious, intriguing movie. It should just be an intriguing, fun, oh man, I can't wait to see those guys bicker again kind of movie. It feels like the team just got going. It feels like it took too long for that to happen. And that doesn't feel as exciting as it should be. Like, I'm more pumped to see a sequel if that happens, just because I kind of would like to see the team actually be the Fantastic Four together. But I feel like I saw like this other strange movie that didn't exactly work and felt like things had to be put in. I don't want to say this is like a horrible movie. Some people just hate this movie because it is a bit of a mess, because it doesn't exactly work. And I'm not going to completely throw Josh Trank under the bus, because I still really like Chronicle, and I was hoping this could be better than it was, but it just doesn't seem like he really has the knack for studio filmmaking. Or maybe the studio was against him. It's not like Fox has a great history of making Fantastic Four movies. I don't want to say there could never be a good Fantastic Four film, because, you know, maybe someone like Brad Bird or somebody interesting could come along and make a really fun Fantastic Four film that really got everything that Jack Kirby was doing, and Stan Lee, or even the John Byrne run. I feel like the first couple issues of Ultimate Fantastic Four kind of laid it out for them, and they could have maybe done that. It just overcomplicates itself and then doesn't really know how to get itself out of it by doing kind of easy kind of fixes. The end fight felt so typical, it felt kind of boring. They just mined the superhero genre for a typical conclusion. It is kind of horrifying to have powers, and especially if you're in the Fantastic Four. If you think of the way the Venture Brothers parodied the Fantastic Four, making Reed look like a madman, and like Johnny Storm was constantly screaming in pain. They are kind of horrifying, strange powers, and playing on that was a really smart idea in kind of a Cronenberg way. Especially Dr. Doom's powers are very Cronenberg-esque as well. And I like that, and I think that's a cool element to it, but it takes all these kind of interesting ideas and cool ideas, meshes them all up with a script that's just not really there and not really connecting any of these characters. If you had more connection to the characters, then I think it could have probably worked a lot better. But with no connection to them, that's the thing about comic books, is like people didn't just read them because of the great stories. It's because they love Spider-Man, they love Batman, they love these certain characters. And Fantastic Four, you don't love the characters, you're kind of like, oh well, that was interesting and intriguing. And thinking about how the story doesn't work isn't what you should be leaving Fantastic Four with. You should be leaving going like, oh man, the Thing's awesome. You're not gonna really think the Thing's awesome. You're gonna think, oh man, that's depressing if you were the Thing. I'm sad now. Certainly the sadness and the depression is an important part of Fantastic Four, and what makes it an interesting and fun book, and a strange book that only kind of comic book dorks probably read anyway. And this doesn't really get into that and make it digestible for a modern audience. It kind of keeps them away, and it doesn't really let them in, and it doesn't really let people in who like the Fantastic Four and want to like a movie like this. It just wants to be the story of the Fantastic Four. It doesn't want to make a movie about the Fantastic Four. This wasn't a film that was made to start a franchise. This was a film that's made as an isolated Fantastic Four movie. And you could say like, well, why does everything gotta be a franchise, man? Let's like chill out, just make a cool movie. And that's an interesting theory, but it's also stupid, because the Fantastic Four is a team that went on multiple adventures. And this is an origin story about them becoming that team that went on multiple adventures and did multiple things. So it just kind of goes against the whole idea of the team, and that's why you have certain parts that just feel like, oh, we're doing this now, particularly the end part. And it's a sad thing to see, because I think Josh Trank, I had a lot of faith in him as a director after Chronicle. I had a lot of faith in this kind of idea of a reboot, and I thought this would be a cool way to do the Fantastic Four, but it completely fails. And this film doesn't understand the fun of the Fantastic Four. And the reason people like superhero movies is it's simple summer escapism, and they like to have fun and see someone do something awesome and laugh and all that stuff. And you're not really getting that. You're getting an odd sophomore effort from an interesting director that kind of falls flat. It's not a film that works on what it really essentially should do. The serious superhero movie thing has been dying for a while since Marvel Studios really came in. And this was an interesting way to kind of do that, and do it in a different way that maybe could get it to work in a post-Marvel Studios era. But it just kind of doesn't really understand why people like these superhero movies in the first place, and why the Fantastic Four could be cool, but also that just the script was a mess. It was a mess. It's just too many different things working at once. It has a lot of things going for it, but it almost felt like that ultimately tore it apart and made it kind of an interesting, ambitious movie. And even if it is, I guess, the best Fantastic Four movie, it's still not the Fantastic Four movie that we'd ultimately like to have, which would actually be a good and decent and fun Fantastic Four movie that'll get people to understand why the Fantastic Four is cool. But this is certainly not the movie to do it. So if you have seen Fantastic Four and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.